15 years later, the cinema is taking its first steps. Cameramen employed by the Lumiere brothers filming at Jerusalem Station provide the first moving pictures taken in Palestine. From now on, the camera is a recording eye, and what it records is this: a society much like that of Cairo, Damascus, or Beirut, in an Arab city much like any other. By the end of the 19th century, Palestine has 500,000 inhabitants, of whom 30,000 live in Jerusalem. An Orthodox Jew, he too turns away from the camera. Here we have an Armenian Pope. Each of the Christian denominations has its church here in the Holy City. The holy places of the three religions are scattered across a few hundred square meters. The Great Mosque is close to Christ's tomb. Further along, at the foot of the Wailing Wall, a Jew is reciting a prayer. He is wearing a Turkish tabush, and though he prays in Hebrew, his everyday language is Arabic. Jews form half the population of Jerusalem, but in the country as a whole, they make up less than 5% of the total. Christians account for 10% and Muslims 85%. All of them are subjects of the Sultan of Constantinople. There are no frontiers in the Ottoman Empire. There are administrative divisions in which, in this immense territory, the same empire in the 17th century. In the meantime, it has lost the Balkans, France and Italy have seized North Africa. England has moved into Egypt, Aden, and even Kuwait.
British and Arab interests are one and the same.
Have you been in Damascus, Mr. Lawrence?
Yes, my lord.
It is beautiful, is it not? I will give you my answer tomorrow, and now it is late. Colonel Brighton means to put my men under European officers, does he not?
In effect, my lord, yes.
And I must do it, because the Turks have European guns. Or is it that you think we are something you can play with? Because we are a little people, a silly people, greedy, barbarous, and cruel. What do you know, Lieutenant? In the Arab city of Cordoba were 2 miles of public lighting in the streets when London was a village.
Yes, you were great.
9 centuries ago.
Time to be great again, my lord.
Which is why my father made this war upon the Turks. My father, Mr. Lawrence, not the English. But my father is old. And I long for the vanished gardens of Cordoba. However, before the gardens must come the fighting. To be great again, it seems that we need the English or what no man can provide, Mr. Lawrence. We need a miracle.
bring down your flag.
I shall not bring down my flag, and if your men attempt it, my men will resist it.
Have you any men, sir?
Enough for that. It's the kind of thing that makes a very ugly incident. It is widely known the Arab Council took power in my name.
They have no power, sir. It's illusory.
Illusions can be very powerful, particularly when they take this form. The world is delighted at the picture of Damascus liberated by the Arab army. Well, General, I will leave you. Major Lawrence Douglas has reports to make about my people and their weakness and the need to keep them weak in the British interest. And French interest, too, of course. We must not forget the French now.
I've told you, sir, no such treaty exists.
Yes, General, you have lied most bravely, but not convincingly.
Are you sure you haven't heard of the Sykes-Picot Treaty?
No. I can guess.
Don't guess. Tell him.
Well, now, Mr. Sykes is an English civil servant. Mr. Picot is a French civil servant. Mr. Sykes and Mr. Picot met, and they agreed that after the war, France and England should share the Turkish Empire, including Arabia. They signed an agreement. Not a treaty, sir. An agreement to that effect.
There may be honor among thieves, but there's none in politicians.
So I've talked to you about the Balfour Declaration many times. Very simply, it's a piece of paper, it's a letter written by the Foreign Secretary in the UK in 1917 to his uncle. It shows you several things. It shows you that, number one, that they gave this land that was not theirs to give to a bunch of Zionists, right? I'm saying the British government who had colonized Palestine. And actually, by that time, you have to remember that this area was under Ottoman rule. I'll go into Lawrence in a second, but just get through my points. The British government was giving a piece of land thousands of kilometers away that doesn't belong to Britain, to a bunch of other Europeans who happen to be Jewish. During this time, you have to remember that while World War I was taking place, and this letter was written in 1917, the British were trying to get the Ottomans out of Arabia and out of Palestine and Syria by organizing an Arab revolt. And they sent T.E. Lawrence, who was in the British Army, very, very famous figure. And he basically got the Arab tribes united, and then he successfully destroyed their presence in Arabia and in the Levant. And he did this under the promise that Britain would leave them alone and make sure that they are able to derive out of that, an independent Arab state. And for a short moment, it actually happened. They brought Prince Faisal to Damascus, and they created a democracy. He was elected as a king of this republic, and then they destroyed this. The French destroyed this, and the British helped them. The point is just that the Arabs worked to kick the Ottomans out, who were occupying them for 400 years. They did this with the promise that Britain would not stand in the way. And then after they helped them kick the Ottomans out, and again, the Ottoman Empire was dissolved when the Germans, were their allies, lost World War I. They screwed them. And what happened is that instead of the Arabs getting their lands back, instead of the Ottoman Empire, it was just replaced by the French and the British Empire. And this was with the Sykes-Picot Agreement in between France and Britain, of course, not the Arabs. It was a secret agreement done in 1916. So while the British were using Lawrence to recruit the Arabs and kick the Ottomans out, in the background, secretly, they had organized the Sykes-Picot Treaty, and they almost got the Russians in on it, but then the Russian Revolution happened in 1917, and they found this document, and Lenin published it in a fucking newspaper and said it was the agreement of the colonial thieves, something like that. Not those exact words, but very similar. So that's 1916. And then 1917, this letter was sent by the British government to this just stinking rich family, who is a Zionist family, the Rothschild family, promising them a chunk of land that doesn't even fucking belong to them. There's no connection to them. The agreement that they had, this is the agreement of the colonial thieves, as Lenin puts it. You see the Sykes-Picot agreement.
It's 67 words long, it's 100 years old, and it changed the course of history for the Middle East and the Jewish people. The Balfour Declaration, the expression of the British government's support for a Jewish home in Palestine, was sent by British Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour to the second Lord Rothschild. I'm here in Buckinghamshire at Waddesdon Manor to speak with the fourth Lord Rothschild.
The Foreign Office, November the 2nd, 1917. Dear Lord Rothschild, I have much pleasure in conveying to you, on behalf of His Majesty's government, the following declaration of sympathy with Jewish Zionist aspirations, which has been submitted to and approved by the Cabinet.
So it's possibly the most famous letter in modern Jewish history, and it begins with 3 words. Dear Lord Rothschild.
That this idea of the national home for Jews should be allowed to take place. I mean, it's so unlikely. Then he starts to fight a difficult battle with the British cabinet, and this letter goes through 5 drafts, as you know. And in the end, it comes out as a rather compromising letter. I mean, the essential point is there for the Jewish community to fasten onto. You have the first bit, which promises a national home rather than the national home, and then you have the bit that nothing that's to be done should in any way harm the Arab community.
The Jewish mob basically starts at the time of the large immigration from East Europe in the late 1880s, 1890s. And of course, poverty, they come into the United States, they move into the cities, and they form the ghettos of the United States, whether it's Baltimore, whether it's Boston, New York, Brooklyn, Detroit, Chicago, Cleveland. And the original Jewish gangster was really, it was brutal. He was a brute. He was brutal. In fact, there's a book that I read many, many years ago that said 25% of the prisoners in the New York prison system were Jews. What were the crimes? A lot of the crimes were violence.
What year was this?
Probably at the turn of the 20th century.
Got it.
Right? And the name of the book was called The Rise and Fall of the Jewish Gangster, Jewish Mobster, something like that. The interesting part about it, Patrick, was that they were involved in all forms of shakedowns, violence, beatings, murders, and prostitution.
Right.
All right? The majority of the prostitute in that time were Jewish women. They'd come, they couldn't find their husbands, and the pimps would be waiting for them on the piers.
Majority of the prostitutes in the 20s were Jewish women.
Not 20s, late 1890s. 1890s, 1900s.
Got it. Okay.
So it was really brutal crime. Now, the generation that comes up that was either born in the United States or had recently immigrated from Europe, let's say, for example, Meyer Lansky, Benny Siegel, Lepke Bullcoulter, My Father's World, and so forth. Some of them were born here, and some were born on the other side and came as young kids. Right? And I'm talking now post-1900. So these kids start as gangs, and what they want, it's control of territory, neighborhoods, and so forth, and control of the ghetto. There was a very, very well-known gangster from Newark. It's amazing. If I'll say to people, who's Abner Longies Willman? If you didn't come from Jersey, you never heard of him. He was on an equal level with Meyer Lansky, Benny Siegel, right? And with Lepke Bullcoulter and Murder and Corporate and so forth. We'll get into that. So his name was Longy. And where did the name Longy came from when the old-timers were being invaded by Italians or Irish or other ethnicities. They would holler in Yiddish, rift for the longer, call the long one, longer. So from the name longer came the name Longy. Abe Longy Zwillman. And he was 6'2", good-looking guy, waxed rich during the Prohibition period, became known as the Al Capone of New Jersey. 75-80% of the alcohol that came into Jersey came in under his rule.
Again, this is still in the 1890s.
No, this now becomes the time of the Prohibition.
Got it.
Those kids that were gangs evolved into businessmen. But I just want to, before we get to anybody, as the young kids by the 1920, at the time of Prohibition, because the law starts in 1920, you have the old-timers, one of them in particular, Arnold Rothstein. Arnold Rothstein was the brain. Now, the brain was allegedly the guy that fixed the 1919 World Series together with an ex-Jewish prizefighter by the name of Abe Attell.
This is White Sox against the Reds. They call it the Black Sox or something like that.
Right. It was the Chicago Black Sox scandal. Yep. So Arnold Rothstein, he didn't come from the ghetto. He came from a middle-class Jewish family, very well respected. He's the one that actually, in fact, is responsible for the modern-day mob. He was the original money guy for bootlegging in New York. We had Murder Incorporated. People just, I'm sure a lot of people are going to be watching this and say, I never knew all of this stuff. The Jews were that tough. We had as many shooters and maybe more than the Italians. Money. Meyer Lansky, for example, Longies Willman, they fought the American Nazi Party. They cooperated with the United States government in Operation Underworld in World War II, and they supplied weapons and arms to Haganah and to Ergun to help create the state of Israel post-World War II, pre-state in Palestine, pre-state Israel. Who's in charge of the Rakoff? Because once Meyer Lansky left Florida to go to Israel, who was in charge of the money coming into? We used to go to Miami. Meyer would have it packaged up, and it would be picked up by a fellow by the name of Sylvain Fetterman from Geneva, Switzerland, who was, I think, somehow or another related to Tibor Rosenbaum, who was the owner of a bank called the International Banque de Crédit, which was the bank that banked both the Rakoff for the mob and was a Mossad bank. It worked both for both organizations. In terms of theology, whether he believed in God, probably not. He wasn't a practicing Jew. He was a nationalistic Jew. All those guys participated in supply of weapons and arms at a time that the Neutrality Act was invoked by Truman, stating that it was a criminal act to supply weapons and arms to Palestine, either to the Arabs or to the Jews. Our guys played a significant role in buying up weapons and arms, surplus weapons and arms post-World War II, and we had all the shipping connections at the port of New York through Frank Costello and Albert Anastasia, so that the longshoremen cooperated with the Jews, with the Zionists, to ship weapons and arms. Meyer Lansky and Longies Willman played significant roles. They went out of their way constantly. I did go to see a hitman by the name of Heshi K.O. Koningsberg, Harold K.O. Koningsberg. He was up in Attica. He was in his 46th year when I went up to see him. Right? And I asked him, I says, because he was a known killer, stone cold killer. Did you have anything to do with the Hoffa? None of your fucking business. I said, okay, I'm sorry, Heshi. He says, but I will tell you something. He says, I'm the guy that was involved in supplying weapons and arms to Israel. And I'm here with an award-winning journalist by name is David Samuels. All right, this is a cute story. So Heshi, he says, 46 years, he says to me, I'm the guy that told Mushy Diane. I said, Mushy, we're on a boat in Marseille, France, all right? And there's going to be guns and weapons. I'm going to just give this to Haganah. I'm going to give this to Ergun, and I'm giving this to the Stern Gang, all right? And if you say one fucking word, I'm going to blow your balls off. Do you understand? And he says, Years later, 1940, 1950, he says, years later, in 1947, 48, he says, I run into Jabotinsky, the father of the revisionist Zionist movement, and he pinches me on my chin and he tells me, good fucking job, Harold, good job, terrific. And I says,
Jerusalem has long been the focal point of the still unsolved problem of Palestine. Although in times of comparative peace, Jews and Arabs live side by side and go about their business in the old city of Jerusalem with apparent calm, beneath the surface, bitter enmity has continued to smoulder for years. This is the Wailing Wall, where many Jews have been offering special prayers following the latest outrage by terrorists. And these are scenes in the modern part of the city, contrasting vividly with the old Jerusalem. The King David Hotel itself. It was in the wing on the right of the picture that the terrorists placed their explosive. And the result of the crime, the tragic scene, is like a serious incident during the Blitz. The hotel housed the British Army headquarters and the Palestine government offices, and casualties were very heavy. 65 deaths are reported, and there is little or no hope of survival for any of the 58 missing. Nearly 50 others were injured. The Jewish terrorist organization, Irgun Zwei Leumi, openly admitted responsibility for the bombing. Many arrests have been made. Leaders of the Jewish agency have expressed horror at the dastardly crime perpetrated by a gang of desperados. Mr. Attlee in the House of Commons declared, the British government will not be diverted by acts of violence in their search for a just and final solution of the Palestine problem. President Truman, condemning the wanton act of terrorism, added that America and Britain are conferring on steps to be taken to implement the report of the Anglo-American Palestine Committee. Undoubtedly, the people of Britain anxiously wait for the announcement of a policy which will prevent the loss of any more innocent lives.
Israelis, Zionists, murdered tons of British soldiers, British police, British citizens, British politicians. There's so many instances, I can't even count them all. It's really that much. They were blowing up train stations and post offices, assassinating British government officials and ministers, and all over the place, like all over the Middle East, even inside London. They tried to kill Winston Churchill while he was fighting the Nazis in World War II. I always remember that, and I think it's funny because, you know, they talk about how anyone who hates them is an anti-Semite, and then when it comes to the Nazis, they were trying to kill Hitler's main opponent, Winston Churchill, who again, I mean, I don't want to talk about Churchill outside of World War II now. I'm just focusing on the period, specifically, they didn't try to kill him, you know, in another period. It's during World War II while England is fighting the Nazis, and I find that weird that Zionists would try to plot his murder in that period. And also they tried to kill Harry Truman, which his daughter actually revealed in a book.
We had several other people in the country, even among the Jews, the Zionists particularly, who were against anything that was to be done if they couldn't have the whole of Palestine and everything handed to them on a silver plate so they wouldn't have to do anything. It couldn't be done. We had to take it in small doses. You can't move 5 or 6 million people out of a country and fill it up with 5 or 6 million more and expect both sets of them to be pleased.
Letter bombs mailed to Truman in 1947 by Eric Pace. The New York Times, Saturday, December 2nd, 1972. The so-called Stern Gang of Zionist terrorists tried to assassinate President Truman by letter bomb in 1947, according to a new biography written by Mr. Truman's daughter. Mrs. Margaret Truman Daniel writes that, quote, a number of cream-colored envelopes about 8 by 6 inches arrived in the White House, addressed to the President and various members of the staff, unquote. They were found to contain powdered gelignite, a pencil battery, and a detonator rigged to explode the gelignite when the envelope was opened, unquote. But the White House mailroom, alert to the danger of postal bombs, discovered the letters and had them defused by Secret Service bomb experts. As far as could be immediately determined, Miss Daniel is the first member of the Truman White House circle to confirm that the letter bombs arrived, although the report also appeared in a 1949 book, Dear Mr. President, The Story of 50 Years in the White House Mailroom, by Ira R.T. Smith. The Palestine problem preoccupied Mr. Truman in a variety of ways during his tenure as president. As early as July 1946, she reports, quote, the effort Dad was making to untangle the mess in Palestine can be seen in a comment he made to his mother. In a letter written in the latter part of 1947, she notes President Truman urged Zionists to show restraint and, quote, consideration for the other people in Palestine, unquote. In another note, written in March 1948, Mr. Truman complained that the, quote, State Department pulled the rug from under me, unquote, with a statement contrary to his own policy on the Palestine question. In the previous summer, Mrs. Daniel writes, the Stern Gang, an ultra-militant Zionist group, quote, tried to assassinate Dad by mail, unquote, by sending the cream-colored envelope. She says that each contained a second, smaller envelope marked private and confidential, which in turn contained the explosive components. She writes that the White House staff was alert to the danger because similar letters had been mailed to high officials in Britain and intercepted. Bombs potentially fatal. Mrs. Daniel notes that the British police had determined that the bombs were powerful enough to kill, or at the very least maim, anyone unlucky enough to open them. Mr. Smith in his book reported that the gang had claimed responsibility for having sent the letters to England from its, quote, branch in Europe, and notes that they were postmarked from Italy. The gang was named for its original leader, Abraham Stern, who had been killed by the British in 1942. According to the press reports in 1947, the Stern gang's claim was made in Jerusalem, and similar explosive envelopes had been found previously in Palestine. The leader of the Stern gang at that time was one Yitzhak Shamir, who would later become the 7th Prime Minister of Israel. Here's a short bio on him from Wikipedia. Yitzhak Shamir was an Israeli politician and the 7th Prime Minister of Israel, serving 2 terms, 1983 to 84 and 1986 to 1992. Before the establishment of the State of Israel, Shamir was a leader of the Zionist paramilitary and terrorist organization Lehi, also known as the Stern Gang. After the establishment of the Israeli state, he served in the Mossad between 1955 and 1965. Shamir was the country's 3rd longest serving prime minister after Benjamin Netanyahu and David Ben-Gurion.
The Haganah, the Irgun, Lehi, they killed a lot of British citizens and soldiers, and they were called they were so-called Jewish terrorists by the British government at the end of World War II. How is it that Britain supports Israel today? Because again, these organizations became the Israeli Defense Forces.
Yes, that's very interesting, the transformation in the view of Zionism through Britain. I think that actually the rule was supporting Zionism. The exception to the rule was negating it in those difficult years for Britain when Zionist terrorists targeted their soldiers and civilians. The rule was that, and that's important to remember historically, Zionism began as an evangelical British project. It was British politicians in high positions who were evangelical Christians long before Jews thought about it. It saw the return of the Jews not just as a strategic asset to Britain because they hoped to take out Palestine that at that time was still under Ottoman rule and included in the British Empire. They also believed that the return of the Jews would be part of a divine scheme that would precipitate the second coming of the Messiah, the resurrection of the dead, and the beginning of the 1,000 years of Christ's rule in the world. These politicians and pundits later on collaborated with the Anglo-Jewish aristocracy that at first was not that keen on the Zionist idea of colonizing Palestine, but began to support it when they understood that this is not targeting them. It's targeting East European Jews that they themselves didn't want to see coming in large numbers to Britain either. So you had this convergence of rather cynical ideas of anti-Semites and Anglo-Jewish aristocracies, providing the support for the Zionist project in Palestine. So that is the basis. Now, there are other factors becoming involved in running Palestine, like people who have strong connections to the Arab world, right? And that happens after the First World War. And they are less enthusiastic about the Zionist project. So you have these clashes. And because of that, British policy does not always is pursued according to the way that the Zionist leaders want it. And eventually the Zionists even go to war against Britain. But it doesn't end the affinity between Britain. Think about the United States. The settler community in the United States rebelled against Britain as well. It didn't create a conflict between, it didn't undermine a later Anglo-American alliance.
Special relationship.
To this very day,
The number of Jews relocating to Israel wasn't enough for the Zionist Ashkenazi state builders. To accelerate the process, Zionist spies planted bombs in Jewish centers in Iraq to create hysteria and panic in order to hasten Jewish Iraqis to flee Iraq and emigrate to Israel. Israeli Jewish historian Avi Shalaim, whose family immigrated to Israel from Iraq when he was 5, told Middle East Eye.
It was part of what somebody described as cruel Zionism. And this was particularly cruel because it involved innocent Jews, decent Jews, good people. And the Zionist movement, or intelligence officers, turned these Jews in Baghdad and then later in Cairo, they turned them into terrorists. They turned them into spies and terrorists against their own homeland.
Over the decades, a combination of push and pull factors eventually led many Mizrahi and Sephardic Jews to emigrate to the state of Israel. But they were less than welcomed.
The Jewish community in Iraq had very little to do with Zionism. Zionism was a movement by European Jews for European Jews. And my mother used to talk a great deal about the wonderful Muslim friends that we had in Baghdad. And one day I asked her, did we have any Zionist friends? And she said, no, Zionism is an Ashkenazi thing. It's nothing to do with us. And I think that reflected the predominant view of Iraqi Jews.
And a white savior story was constructed about how Middle Eastern Jews were saved from savage Muslims, as well as the savagery within themselves.
The Zionist movement until 1948 was not particularly interested in the Jewish communities in the Arab world because they wanted to create a European country and they regarded the Arab Jews as Arabs. But because of the Holocaust and because of the fact that even people who survived the Holocaust did not come in large numbers to Israel, and the Anglo-American communities of Jews felt safe enough in their countries and stayed stayed in those countries. There was a demographic issue, and that's when the Zionist leadership or the early young Israeli leadership decided to make an effort and bring the Jews from the Arab countries. Now, they had a problem. The Jews in the Arab countries did not suffer from the kind of anti-Semitism that Europe experienced during the Second World War, and it was not that easy to persuade them. Neither, there were established Jewish communities in North Africa, in Egypt, in Syria, in Iraq, and in Lebanon, integrated into their society. And even when they felt the pressure because of Zionism and the rise of Arab nationalism that began, like Zionism, to identify them with Zionism, unfortunately for them, although most of them were not Zionists, even when they felt the pressure, they preferred to go outside of the Middle East rather than to go to Israel. So the Israelis needed to accelerate this massive immigration. And as you're absolutely right, in the case of Iraq, they needed to bomb the synagogues in order to create that kind of fear. In Syria, it took a long time before the Syrians and Lebanese as well came, and you needed more or less, and that is true about North Africa as well. You needed the -- war in many ways to create the last phases in the history of these remarkable communities. And unfortunately, as Israel became a fact, and it began to also target neighboring Arab countries and not just the Palestinians, it was very difficult, even if you were a genuine Syrian Jew who had nothing to do with Zionism, it was very difficult to persuade those around you that this is the case,
I wanted to find out who Maxwell really was and how he built such an empire. Maxwell was keen to let everyone know he was a decorated war hero. But his life in post-war Berlin is where things got very shady. He runs a very, very lucrative black market operation, buying and selling cigarettes and nylons and all chewing gum, food, everything. He is the heart of taking goods from zone to zone and putting the cash in his pocket. And Maxwell was someone who wants power, who wants influence, who wants wealth, who wants to change the world. He goes across the Russians, declares himself, gets on very well with them, and establishes good connections. He becomes a KGB agent.
Maxwell was a special person. He was received in our high spheres. In our parlance, it was called an useful official relation. So that meant that a foreigner can be useful to us as a person who would have an access to some information, who would willingly or unwillingly share it with us.
At the same time, he presents himself to MI6, and he says that he's established amazing connections with leading scientists all over the world. Unbelievably, what he really wanted was MI6 to finance him to start a publishing company.
It was obvious that he'd been doing odd things for MI6 from Germany already, and he suggested that we should subsidize him to buy a book business. I don't know of any other case. I was certainly never involved in any other case of MI6 buying a business for anybody.
He's both working for British intelligence and Russian intelligence. No loyalties other than to himself.
The Nakba is commemorated on May 15th of every year, and it refers to the near total destruction of Palestinian society at the hands of Zionist militias upon the establishment of Israel. But the Nakba is not a tragic relic from the past. Rather, it is a planned, organized, and most importantly, an ongoing process of ethnic cleansing. It's argued that the Nakba officially started with the issuing of the 1917 Balfour Declaration, through which the British government committed to the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, as if Palestine was the property of the Brits in the first place. Then, in 1920, the British colonization of Palestine began. With it came a brutal crackdown on any anti-colonial organizing or national sentiment. With the help of the Brits, the Jewish population in Palestine increased from 9% to almost 27%. The British officially ended their rule in Palestine on May 14th, 1948, and left their artillery and tanks for the new Zionist regime to use. Shortly after this, the fighting broke out between Palestinians and Zionists Zionist armed groups who had gained training in arms from fighting with Britain in World War II. The Zionist forces waged a brutal campaign of ethnic cleansing. Over 750,000 Palestinians were forcibly expelled from their lands and rendered refugees outside of the borders of their own homeland. The Zionist forces had seized over 78% of historic Palestine, destroying and depopulating 530 villages and cities and committing over 70 massacres. Since then, the Nakba became firmly established as a systemic practice that continues to be implemented by the Israeli state to this day.
If you look at mass media, the story you find is that they fire hundreds of rockets into Israeli cities right across the border. Everything before that point is left out. Most commonly, we hear of rockets hitting the border city of Sderot. It is home to the notorious Sderot cinema, where settlers drink beer and eat popcorn watching bombs fall onto Gaza. Sderot was once called Hajj, a village that was 100% Palestinian and Muslim. Israeli historian Benny Morris uncovered that not only did Palestinian residents get along well with Jewish settlers, but they actually hid and protected them from British occupation forces in 1946. When a British army dragnet was rounding up members of a Jewish paramilitary, the Palestinians of Hajj kept them safe. It came as a shock to them when just about a year later, that same paramilitary violently expelled every single resident of Hajj. All fled to Gaza. Hajj was renamed Sderot, and settlers from all over the world started to move there. This is the family history of almost every current resident of Gaza, where roughly 75% of people living there are refugees from villages just outside of their border. They were among the 500 Arab villages completely depopulated at the barrel of a gun in 1948, in what became known as the Nakba. Those who wouldn't leave their homes were killed. That year, the United Nations issued Resolution 194, which mandated that all of the 750,000 Palestinians made refugees from the Nakba had the right to return to the land they were ethnically cleansed from. From that day forward, Israel has refused, in flagrant violation of international law. Displacement of the indigenous population was always the plan. As founder and first Prime Minister Ben-Gurion declared, "We must expel the Arabs and take their places." Just 6 months after Israel's creation, top-secret military orders revealed their policy targeting the movement of civilian Arabs from Gaza. Their mission, put plainly, expulsion of the Arab villagers and denial of their return by demolishing their houses, to gather all the residents and deport them to Gaza, to burn down the villages, and most shockingly, surveying the refugees' way of movement and laying mines in the routes. And in 1954, the Prevention of Infiltration Law was created to punish any refugee trying to return, under which a shoot-to-kill policy was employed, like the one still used today.
These are the citizens of tomorrow who need help urgently to live today. It's the old question, am I my brother's keeper? The answer is yes. You and everyone who is made aware of a great tragedy must assume a responsibility to end it. This is a problem which cries out to the civilized world for a quick, a humanitarian, a permanent solution.
But the story doesn't end there. In a massive military offensive in 1967, they seized the Gaza Strip and West Bank and put them under martial law. Prime Minister at the time, Levi Eshkol, was very open about their depopulation plans for Gaza. One tactic he proposed to get its inhabitants to flee has carried on to this day. He said, "Perhaps if we don't give them enough water, they won't have a choice, because the orchards will yellow and wither."
In another camp, a well that normally provided water for 2,000 people soon dried up after being used by 13,000 or more. Some Palestine refugees have lived in camps for 30 years, have raised families in them, who in turn have raised children of their own. 3 generations of refugees. It hardly seems possible.
Which is the city that my father
המוח שלו 7-5, תזכר. היו שבויים, היו נשים לחוד וגברים לחוד. פתאום אחד בשם רז, פתאום הוא רואה אחד עם נעליים של גבר ולובש שמלה. אז המפקד היחידה שהוא היה מפריד, הוציא אותו הצידה, אני עמדתי אחרי המחבל הזה, זז הצידה, נתן לו 3 כדורים בראש, חיסל אותו.
המון הרוגים היו, המון, עד שאספנו אותם. זה לקח יומיים עד שאנחנו סילקנו את הגופות. למה? פחדנו שיבואו ויצלמו וילכלכו את השם של המדינה, אז רצינו להעלים אותם.
In May of 1988, to commemorate the 40th anniversary of Israel's establishment, The Nation ran an article by a prominent Israeli journalist and commentator named Amos Kenan. And he was relating his experiences for the 1948 war. And at one point says at night, those of us, and I'm quoting him verbatim, at night, those of us who couldn't restrain themselves would go into prisons to fuck Arab women, pardon my French, but I'm quoting him verbatim, into Israeli prisons. There was a recent scandal in Germany of a Palestinian woman who was supposed to receive a literary prize for a book of for a novel she had written that was then withdrawn, essentially because she was Palestinian. And it was a novel. I forgive me for not remembering the name of either the author or the book, but it was based on a true story, which has also been, by the way, reported in the Israeli press, of a girl from a Bedouin family in 1948 who was kept as a sexual slave by an Israeli army unit and then summarily executed when they were done with her.
Minor detail, I believe, right? Minor detail.
Thank you. Yes, minor detail.
משהו נורא. טנטורה היה כפר עשיר, בתים יפים, שערים כמו אירופאים, אתה יודע. וגם אנשים היו לבושות ויפה, וזה באמת היה כפר... אחד אנס שם איזה ילדה בת 16, משהו כזה. אתה מבין? אבל זה מכוער מאוד, היה לנו בחור אחד, הוא נפטר, הוא היה פרא אדם. הוא לקח פשוט מאוד, ורצח אותם בתוך המכלאות. בתוך המכלאות, הם היו במכלאות. אתה יודע, חוטי ברזל כאלה, עגולים כאלה, אספו כל הדברים. הם יושבים שם כל העם על הרצפה, ובא מישהו ולוקח תת מקלע ומתחיל זה, מחליף מחסנית, מה אתה חושב זה? והשתיקו את הדבר הזה, והיו חבר'ה שלקחו את הלוויורים, ורדפו אחרי חבר'ה ושרפו אותם, זה היה משהו זוועתי, וזה אסור לספר, אני לא אדבר על זה, כי זה יכול להיות סקנדל שלם מהעניין הזה. אני לא רוצה לדבר על זה, וזהו.
3-4 חודשים הראשונים הייתי רוצח.
מה זה אומר?
אני לא לקחתי שבויים. בזמן קרב, אם מישהו ירים ידיים, משהו כזה, לא לקחתי שבויים. זה זעזע אותי עד כדי כך, לא יכלתי לעבור לסדר היום. אם היה עומדת כיתה של זה, עם ידיים למעלה, אז באותו יום הייתי רואה אותי, הייתי קוצר את כולם, עד כדי כך.
כמה אתה חושב אנשים הרגת ככה?
לא ספרתי. אני לא יכול לדעת בחיי. היה לי מקלע עם 250 כדורים. תראה, יריתי, נלחמתי כולם, אני לא יכול לספור.
When were Palestinians born? What was all this area before the First World War? When Britain got the mandate over Palestine, what was Palestine then? Palestine was then the area between the Mediterranean and the Iraqi border. East and West Bank was Palestine. I'm a Palestinian. From 21 until 48, I carried a Palestinian passport.
British Uganda. This project was known as the Uganda Scheme, a proposal presented in 1903 by Theodore Herzl to create a Jewish homeland in a portion of British East Africa. He presented it as a temporary refuge for Jews to escape rising persecution of Jewish people in Europe. Other people who advocated for the creation of a Jewish state didn't agree with the location. Some others pitched the idea of it instead happening in Portuguese Angola, a thought that had existed since 1886, proposed by some as historical reparation for their expulsion in the 15th century in connection to the article that I just mentioned, with Mozambique also being an alternative, but neither were followed. As the British seemed committed to Uganda, Joseph Chamberlain even stated, if Dr. Herzl were at all inclined to transfer his efforts to East Africa, there would be no difficulty in finding land suitable for Jewish settlers. They ended up agreeing to establish it and even sent a delegation to prepare for the settling, but then realized the natives were against it. And apparently there were too many lions making it dangerous. This sounds ridiculous, but is actually listed as the main reason for the failure. The British Empire had one more attempt at establishing a Jewish state before moving forward with the Palestine option, Guyana. In 1939, a plan to resettle a modest number of Jewish refugees in British Guyana existed, but was put on hold due to the start of World War II. The British government decided that the problem is at present too problematic to admit of the adoption of a definite policy and must be left for the decision of some future government in years to come. One other plan that is said to have existed is the Fugu Plan in Japan. Marvin Tokayer and Mary Swartz published a book called The Fugu Plan in 1979. In this partly fictionalized book, they refer to memoranda written in 1930s Imperial Japan proposing settling Jewish refugees escaping persecution in Europe. They supposedly proposed that a large number of Jewish people should be encouraged to settle in Manchukuo or Japan-occupied Shanghai, taking advantage of the supposed economic prowess of the Jewish people, as well as gaining favor with the United States. The signing of the Tripartite Pact in 1941 and other events prevented its full implementation according to these authors. There was a proposal for a Jewish self-governing territory within Italian East Africa. The Italian dictator's government in the early 20th century offered to resolve what they called the Jewish problem in Europe by resettling these people into a self-governing territory in their colonial possession. There was apparently a small Jewish community living there already in what is today Ethiopia. The proposed self-governing territory was to be within the Italian Empire and would likely mean harsh and awful living conditions. Thankfully, Mussolini's plan was also never implemented. And finally, one other short-lived attempt was Port Davey in Australia. The explanation for this one is as short as its existence. In around 1940, with the support of the then Premier of Tasmania, Robert Cosgrove, a man called Critchley Parker proposed the creation of a Jewish settlement at Port Davey in southwest Tasmania, Australia. He went as far as surveying the area, but then he died in 1942, and this idea died along with him.
أتى عبد الناصر بعد أيام، وبالتحديد في أوائل مارس 1955، واجتمع بكبار رجال المدينة ورؤسائها وأقسم بأن هذا الاعتداء لن ينساه.
In November 1955, Ben-Gurion began a second term as Israel's prime minister. At the top of his agenda was how to respond to the growing strength of Egypt. 8 months later, the opportunity came when Nasser announced the nationalization of the Suez Canal, a decision that outraged the British and French, the owners of the International Canal Company.
This is a matter of life and death to us all. Our quarrel is not with Egypt, still less with the Arab world. It is with Colonel Nasser.
Britain and France were convinced that military intervention would be needed to recapture the canal and bring down the upstart Nasser. But a pretext was needed.
فرنسا على لسان بينو وزير الخارجية اقترح انه اسرائيل تدخل معهم كعامل مساعد اللي اعطاهم الذريعة للتدخل على اساس انهم هيطلبوا من كلا الطرفين المتحاربين التحرك لمسافة 10 أميال على جانبي قناة السويس. اسرائيل بالقطع كانت هتقبل ومصر سترفض فتعطي الذريعة لانجلترا وفرنسا انهم يعلنوا الحرب عليها.
According to this tripartite secret agreement, on the 29th of October 1956, Israeli forces crossed the border into Egypt. British and French troops began landing in Port Said, at the Mediterranean end of the canal.
The United States was not consulted in any way about any phase of these actions, nor were we informed of them in advance. It is our hope and intent that this matter will be brought before the United Nations General Assembly. There, with no veto operating, the opinion of the world can be brought to bear in our quest for a just end to this tormenting problem.
By the end of December, under heavy international pressure, the British and French were forced into a humiliating withdrawal from Port Said. Global attention now shifted to Israel, still occupying the whole of the Sinai and the Gaza Strip. In March 1957, Ben-Gurion finally ordered the Israeli army to withdraw to the pre-war borders.
The Sinai campaign gave Israel actually about 10 years of unsigned peace. On the Egyptian border between 1957 and 1967, there was a total calm.
But the fragile peace on the borders masked continuing hostility between Cairo and Tel Aviv. In Israel, Ezer Weizmann, the commander of the Air Force, was devising a new strategy. Operation Focus.
האמת היא שהתאמנו למבצע שנים לא מעטות לפני הביצוע עצמו. הקונספט היה שאנחנו תוקפים את המסלולים ומוצאים אותם משימוש. ולאחר מכן מתארגנים לצליפה ויורים במטוסים הפזורים בשדה.
In April 1967, the border skirmishes with Syria escalated into a full-scale aerial battle.
We shot down 7 aircraft. It was such a victory in the Israeli Air Force.
In the weeks following this battle, reports, possibly originating with Soviet intelligence, began to come in that Israel was massing its army on the Syrian border. An apparent escalation that spurred Nasser into action. On the 14th of May, 1967, he ordered Egyptian troops into Sinai.
مصر دخلت هذه الحرب وليس في نيتها الهجوم. وانه مجرد ان 130,000 عسكري يتواجدوا في سيناء هيخلق شيء من الردع لاسرائيل من انها تقوم بعمل مسلح او تحاول انها تغزو او تهاجم سوريا.
News of Nasser's actions brought people out onto the streets, all across the Arab world.
حصلت حمية عربية في هذه المرحلة، إسرائيل استغلتها تماما سياسيا وإعلاميا إنها معرضة إلى الفناء، وبالتالي ادت نفسها مبرر لشن الضربة الاستباقية أو الضربة الإجهاضية لحماية نفسها.
Israel's new war cabinet under Levi Eshkol took the decision to open hostilities on the 5th of June, 1967. The Air Force was given the green light to launch Operation Focus, the aerial attack it had been rehearsing for years. The Israelis had rolled the dice, which would determine the future of their state.
طائرتين جايين من بعيد لونهم غامق قوي كده، ويا دوبك احنا ركزنا فيهم كانت القنابل بتنزل على الممر. وطخ طخ طخ وبقت الويف بقى.
By midday, the Israelis had successfully attacked 18 airfields. The Egyptians had lost 80% of their air force. More than 300 planes destroyed on the ground.
الطيارات بتاعتنا كانت مرصوصه في المطارات زي مطار زيورخ. مفيش تركيز هندسي اللي يدوسها للطيارات، مفيش دفاع جوي قوي، مفيش رادارات قويه تكشف الضربه الجويه اللي חלصت على الدفاع الجوي والطيارات في ساعتين.
וכך מלחמת ששת הימים, שנחשבת לאיזה מין אירוע צבאי חשוב בהיסטוריה הצבאית, בעצם לא הייתה מלחמה. זה היה מרדף באש חיה מול אויב בורח ולא נלחם. ואחרי המלחמה, כיוון שההישג היה עצום, החליטו להסתיר את כל הכישלונות, להסתיר את כל הבעיות, ולפרסם סיפור שהניצחון היה בגלל שצה"ל הוא אחד הצבאות הטובים בהיסטוריה. ומפקדי צה"ל הם גאונים שכמוהם אולי לא היו בכלל בהיסטוריה.
By the fourth day of the war, Israeli troops reached the eastern bank of the Suez Canal. At the end of the sixth day of fighting, and only when it had achieved all its goals, Israel accepted the UN ceasefire. Israel had tripled its size, capturing the Sinai Peninsula, the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, eastern Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights.
There were songs written, there were victory albums, there was a huge intoxication of victory. This huge, unique, miraculous victory of the Israeli army in that war was the greatest tragedy in the history of Israel.
The Israelis basked in an aura of invincibility. Israel found itself governing and being responsible for a million Palestinians in the newly occupied Gaza Strip, West Bank, and Jerusalem. In addition to the West Bank, settlements were spreading in the Gaza Strip, Sinai, and on the Golan Heights. And as the Israelis tightened their grip on the occupied territories, it became clear they had no intention of returning them.
There already exist two states for the Palestinians, one in Gaza, a full-blown state run by Hamas.
Israel's own leading expert on international law, Professor Yoram Dinstein, disagrees. Writing in his International Law of Belligerent Occupation, the proposition that the Israeli occupation in the Gaza Strip is over is not the prevalent opinion, and the present writer cannot possibly accept it. Human Rights Watch puts it even more directly. Whether the Israeli army is inside Gaza or redeployed around its periphery, and restricting entrance and exit, it remains in control. And despite what Israel's current information minister Distal Atbarian says, the Israeli Supreme Court has held that the West Bank is indeed held by the State of Israel in belligerent occupation. The long arm of the state in the area is the military commander. It's hard to argue with the fact that the continuing occupation, which has been called the world's longest, has brought decreasing material conditions and quality of life for the Palestinians. Whether through home demolitions, routine raids in the West Bank, the blockade of Gaza, which has left nearly half of its citizens unemployed and 80% of its water unfit for human consumption, to discrimination, to checkpoints, to settlements, the consequences of the June 1967 war are a continuing issue. The justification for the war has been, in turn, the justification for the occupation. The conventional wisdom has held that it was only because Egypt's Gamal Abdel Nasser sought to destroy Israel outright that they launched their preemptive attack on the morning of June 5, 1967. According to Israeli historian Avi Shleim in his mammoth history of Israel, The Iron Wall, the Six-Day War was a defensive war. It was launched by Israel to safeguard its security, not to expand its territory. But what if that weren't true? The 1967 war needs some context. Just months before the conflict, things had been escalating rapidly between Israel and its neighbors. What was once an atmosphere of animosity descended into a road to war on November 16, 1966. On that day, an armored brigade of 4,000 Israeli troops, accompanied by tanks, launched an attack on the village of Samu in the West Bank, which was then under the control of Jordan, a devastating attack which killed 18 Jordanian soldiers. When the first Israeli column reached Samu, the soldiers started a carefully planned destruction of houses and property. Through shelling, airstrikes, and dynamite, the troops destroyed 125 homes, along with other buildings. This marked the most serious escalation of the Arab-Israeli conflict since the 1956 Suez Crisis. Israel claimed that the attack was a reprisal for Palestinian infiltrators crossing into Israel from Jordan. The explanation had little basis in reality, since Jordanian troops had killed more Palestinians crossing into Israel than the Israelis had. Nevertheless, the outcome of the raid was favorable to Israel, since it stoked resentment between the Arab states, especially Egypt and Jordan. Jordan felt that Egypt had failed to come to its defense. The two countries would reconcile, though, reaching a defense pact, which would have important implications in the ensuing Six-Day War. The situation was close to boiling over, and just 2 months before the war, 6 Syrian fighter jets were shot down by Israeli forces. It's possible that this air war, too, was instigated by Israel. Though he wouldn't admit it publicly at the time, Israeli Defense Minister Moshe Dayan would privately tell reporter Rami Tal the truth in 1976. It would be published 21 years later, after Dayan had already died. I know how at least 80% of the clashes there started. In my opinion, more than 80%. It went this way. We would send a tractor to plow someplace in the demilitarized area, and knew in advance that the Syrians would start to shoot. If they didn't shoot, we would tell the tractor to advance farther, until in the end, the Syrians get annoyed and shoot. And then we would use artillery, and later the Air Force. Israel's strategy of escalation on the Syrian front was probably the single most important factor in dragging the Middle East to war in June 1967. Surprisingly, Moshe Dayan appeared to agree. The nature and scale of our reprisal actions against Syria and Jordan had left Nasser with no choice but to defend his image and prestige throughout the Arab world, thereby setting off a train of escalation in the entire Arab region. This escalation culminated in Nasser moving troops into the Sinai and cutting off the Straits of Tiran, which proved to be the nail in the coffin. And on June 5th, war broke out. When the Israelis launched the surprise offensive, they attacked on a Monday, knowing that on Wednesday, the Egyptian vice president would arrive in Washington to talk about reopening the Strait of Tiran. We might not have succeeded in getting Egypt to reopen the strait, but it was a real possibility. The Six-Day War was the most spectacular military victory in Israel's history. On the morning of Monday, June 5th, Israel launched a surprise first strike against Egypt's air force. Egypt had no fortified bunkers to speak of, leaving its entire fleet exposed. The strike wiped out 90% of its planes, just sitting on the ground. And just like that, virtually the entire Egyptian air force was destroyed in less than 2 hours. When Jordan and Syria joined the war, their air forces were wiped out that same afternoon. Even an Iraqi airfield near the Jordanian border was obliterated. In all, more than 400 enemy planes were destroyed in a day. In one fell swoop, Israel now enjoyed total air superiority against all its neighbors. The UN Security Council introduced a ceasefire the next day, June 6th. By Friday, June 9th, 5 days into the war, Israel had defeated the ground forces of Egypt and Jordan, capturing Gaza, the West Bank, and Arab East Jerusalem. Now Jordan, Egypt, and Syria all agreed to cease hostilities, but the Israeli offensive continued. Having already captured the Sinai, the West Bank, and Gaza, Israel continued its offensive on the northern front to capture the Syrian Golan Heights. This move ultimately cost Israel its diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union. Did Israel invade Syria to safeguard its security? Interestingly enough, in Israeli historian Avi Shlaim's same book where he claims the Six-Day War was a defensive war, he cites Moshe Dayan's posthumous interview where he describes the Syrian so-called threat. You don't strike at the enemy because he is a bastard, but because he threatens you. And the Syrians, on the fourth day of the war, were not a threat to us. The war is often talked about for its lightning speed, show of military might, and the territory gained, but one overlooked detail is the massive displacement that followed the Israeli offensive. You see here how the war has destroyed the lives of thousands of families, uprooting them from their homes. Roads throughout the West Bank were crammed with long columns of refugees. Civilians desperately crossed rivers through shattered bridges hoping to seek refuge in Jordan. At a cabinet meeting, Defense Minister Moshe Dayan was overjoyed with the number of refugees. I hope they all go. If we could achieve the departure of 300,000 without pressure, that would be a great blessing. The Nakba, or the major ethnic cleansing campaign of 1948, was less than 20 years earlier. Still fresh and vivid memories of massacres, such as the one at Deir Yassin, compelled many thousands to flee. After the war, they would not be allowed to return. As in 1948, Israeli forces made use of psychological warfare units who blared messages over loudspeakers mounted on jeeps, commanding the Arabs to leave their homes. One operation in the city of Qalqilia forced out as many as 12,000 people and destroyed over 800 homes. The instructions were clear: evacuate the residents and destroy the place. This pattern continued throughout the conflict. Among the largest villages cleansed were Imwas, Yalu, and Beit Nuba. According to Israel's own estimates, the war produced as many as 250,000 refugees. Adding to the more than 700,000 produced as a result of the Nakba, the tally of displacement grew considerably as a result of this short but bloody and devastating conflict. We've discussed the Syrian threat, but the principal threat, according to the Israelis, underscored by their first strike, was Egypt. Regarding the Six-Day War, Johnson would speak candidly about Egypt, which was at the time known as the United Arab Republic, or UAR. During the evening of May 26th, I met with Israel's foreign minister, Abba Eban, who said that according to Israeli intelligence, the United Arab Republic was preparing an all-out attack. I asked Secretary McNamara to give Mr. Eban a summary of our findings. 3 separate intelligence groups had looked carefully into the matter, McNamara said, and it was our best judgment that a UAR attack was not imminent. Abba Eban's own autobiography, published the next year, indeed included the shocking admission that Nasser did not want war. He wanted victory without war. A similarly worded summary can be found from, amazingly, the chief of Israel's foreign intelligence service, the Mossad. Egypt was not ready for a war, and Nasser did not want a war. Even top military brass went against the official version. In a speech proclaiming Israel's victory on June 12th, Prime Minister Levi Eshkol declared, the Arab leaders' hopes of exterminating Israel were dashed. The first challenge to this myth reportedly began with Major General Matityahu Peled in front of an audience at the Zatfa Club in Tel Aviv. The crowd reportedly went into a shock when they heard the now-retired general say, the thesis according to which the danger of genocide hung over us and Israel was fighting for her very physical survival was nothing but a bluff which was born and bred after the war. Several other generals then followed suit. There never was a danger of extermination, said Ezer Weissman, who commanded the Israeli Air Force during its devastating first strike against Egypt. We were not threatened with genocide on the eve of the Six-Day War, and we never thought of such a possibility, observed General and Deputy Chief of Staff Chaim Bar-Lev. And we can't forget the Chief of Staff, who was none other than future Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, who told Le Monde in May 1972, I do not believe that Nasser wanted war. And finally, from the mouth of another Prime Minister. During his tenure in 1982, Menachem Begin stated flatly, the Egyptian army concentrations in the Sinai approaches did not prove that Nasser was really about to attack us. We must be honest with ourselves. We decided to attack him. More than half a century of military occupation. While time seemed to have a somewhat civilizing effect on the Jim Crow South or apartheid South Africa, the Palestinians have not shaken their subjugation. In fact, it has only become gravely worse with time. It came as a shock to the Western world when the Second Intifada broke out, on the heels of the Second Oslo Accords, which was seen as such a triumphant success for Jews and Arabs alike. But whereas the Palestinians once upon a time were able to say, drive from Ramallah to Jerusalem in under a half hour, or travel from Gaza to the West Bank, New checkpoints, walls, and Israeli permits almost impossible to attain blocked their free movement. Arabs now use different buses, roads, even using different license plates, causing the progressive constriction of Palestinian life. Indeed, things only got worse after Oslo. More than 500,000 settlers now reside in the West Bank, with no sign of slowing down, bulldozing houses to pave way for new ones.